Chapter 84, Spooky Times for Antony, Antony's POV. Antony had been sleeping again when Theodora arrived to whisk him away. This left him unable to claim that he was too busy to go with her, so he'd bid his offerings. Would he ever get used to that plural goodbye and trailed reluctantly after her? She clearly still wanted him for her friend. The other day, the feeling of her big, solid body curled against him while Hanyu read had been unbelievably soothing. At the same time, he felt shy of her. He had imposed so often on her goodness, forced her to forgive so much that wasn't forgivable. Surely her patience with him was reaching its limit. "Claudia says hello," he said lamely once they were in the hall. He'd had a frantic letter from his twin, demanding to know why she hadn't heard from him. That had caused enough guilt for him to drown in. He should have thought how his long silence would worry her with Titus still missing. Replying had been difficult. He hadn't wanted to explain everything that had happened, but he couldn't bear for her to think that he'd been ignoring her on purpose. Finally, he just lied. He hated lying to her. She'd been so wounded when he told everyone about Valerius, and she'd realized that he'd been keeping his lover a secret from her for years. All these fathomless ages later, he still remembered the look on her face. He'd sworn then that he wouldn't lie to her again. But she wouldn't understand about Marcus. It was too complicated to explain in a letter. He'd finally given up and committed to the lie. "I was injured in a storm last week," he'd written. "Then, when I was on the mend, I disobeyed Julia, always a dangerous undertaking, and did too much moving around. There was also some chaos because I finally got fed up with the way Marcus has been treating his offering and confiscated the poor man. Don't worry, I'm all right now, but that's why I haven't been in touch. Forgive me?" He was grateful nobody else had enchanted paper. Back when they'd had so many ways to send messages magically, it had been nothing but a toy used mainly by children. Claudia had only put their 3 old connected sheets on the ship out of sentimentality. With their magic lost, however, it had proved to be a treasure beyond price. And if Julia or Theo had had a sheet that connected with Claudia's, it would have made his deceptions far too easy to uncover. Luckily, they did not, so Claudia could only offer her greetings through Antony. It eased his conscience a little to dutifully relay them, though he couldn't help wondering how it made Claudia feel to be stuck communicating with the woman she had been going to marry through the brother her lover had chosen over her. He'd never really understood why Theo had decided to come with him. She'd already been against splitting their band to begin with. "We've already lost so much. Why should we let go of each other, too?" was what he remembered her saying, but once it came down to choosing, he'd never thought she would pick him. From the time she and Claudia had first become lovers, he'd simply taken it for granted that Theodora would always choose his sister over him. It wasn't an unfamiliar situation, though Antony was used to being on the other side of it. Being twins, he and Claudia had always shared friends, and he had always been the more charismatic of the two. He knew it would have been unfair to begrudge his sister having a greater share in one friend, even if she was the dearest friend either of them had ever had. But Theodora had chosen him. So had Felix and Julia and Thad. That had to have wounded Claudia, but she'd never said a word about it to him. Just like none of the vampires had ever chastised him for getting them cursed in the first place, and Hanyu hadn't yet started to hate him for everything he'd done to the poor man. How much mercy could one person expect from so many other people? Surely he was nearing the limits. A reckoning had to be drawing near. He was drawn out of his melancholy when he noticed Theodora's reaction to his sister's greeting. Her shoulders stiffened a little, and she looked out at the deck. "Oh," she said. "Kind of her to think of me." "Since when does she think of much else?" he asked. They hadn't made their engagement public or set a date when they were cursed. As much as the consort had raged about her niece fraternizing with the 3 bastards, Claudia had feared what she would do if Theodora were to announce her plans to marry one of them. But they had talked about their future together with an untroubled certainty that Antony, yearning for public recognition of his own relationship with Valerius, had envied them. Surely Theo didn't think his sister would simply forget her, no matter how many weary years dragged past. Theodora huffed. It's been centuries. Come on, let's get you to my room so you can sit down. Antony limped along beside her. When he stumbled and she threw him a concerned look, he started talking again, desperately. It was such a relief to be talking about her personal life instead of his for a change. She's never gotten over you, you know, centuries or not. Theodora sighed and looked at the ceiling. Do we have to talk about this today? You've been knee-deep in my relationships lately, Antony grumbled. Seems only fair. Theo was quiet for a long moment, and Antony began to worry that he really had pushed too far. Still, after she'd seen him bloody and groveling for more, she could hardly be made to feel more vulnerable than that by any question. Claudia and I don't have a relationship anymore, she said at last. I miss her too. Of course I do, every day, and I miss Titus, but we don't really know each other anymore. She's in love with a memory. She's always asking for you to move to her ship. Why was Antony bringing this up? It was one of his worst fears. You could get to know her again. Theodora glanced down at him, then reached out to tug at his braid, chuckling at his squawk of protest. Nah, she said. I'm with you, always. Promise. Why? He hadn't asked it 1,000 years ago, and it was too late to ask now. He would have sounded utterly pitiful. But that didn't mean he would ever stop wondering. They were both silent while they walked the rest of the way to her rooms. For once, they were empty. Antony looked around in shock. I asked everyone to go above for a while, she explained when she saw the look. Now that your own room is getting so full, I thought you might like a little privacy. There was no denying that. Antony had felt intrusive and out of place in his rooms ever since Asau had moved in. He did his best not to eavesdrop on Hanyu and Asau, but he still knew that they had been quiet and stiff with one another the entire time, and he could only assume that it was because of his presence. Hanyu had said that he wasn't in love with Asau, and Antony believed him. But they were still old, dear friends, and they deserved to enjoy whatever sort of intimacy they wanted without him hovering over them. It reminded him of the way he and his siblings had behaved when their father was around. Tense, controlled, excessively courteous. The thought made him miserable, though he had no right to the feeling. He'd done worse to these men than his father had ever done to him. It might hurt to think of Hanyu seeing him that way, but it was no more than he deserved. How is Asau? Theodora asked, leading him into her little alcove. They settled on the bed, and Antony tried to think of a way to respond. In the end, he couldn't come up with anything but the shameful truth. I have no idea, he exhaled. He's not exactly communicative. Theodora snorted, then started giggling. Antony whirled on her, indignant. What? He demanded. What's so funny? There is some justice in the world, chortled his friend. Is it my birthday? Antony has been saddled with someone who won't talk about his feelings. Antony folded his arms, aware that he was pouting. Oh, shut up. Sorry, she snickered, not sounding terribly sorry at all. But you have to admit that it's deserved. Just talk to him, Antony. He won't open up right away, but as long as you start by being honest and vulnerable yourself, people usually respond in kind eventually. You're not honest, you're blunt, snapped Antony. I don't think that's the best approach for him, either. She shrugged. Have it your way, but bluntness seems to work well with Hanyu. I think you could stand to be blunter with him. Hanyu? Antony was going to get whiplash from this damn conversation. What could there be to be blunt about with Hanyu? He says whatever he's thinking. I know how he feels. A few hours later, with Hanyu and Asau bent humbly at his feet, he was less sure about that. Hanyu looked fine and normal once Antony got them to kneel up. Maybe this was just a fluke. After all, the man did still kneel and call him my lord sometimes. He turned his attention back to Asau. He still didn't look well. His eyes were shadowed and his face was too thin. The bandages on his injured hand were stark against the sunrise pink of his robe. Antony's gut twisted guiltily at the sight of him as the man spoke. I look forward to being able to repay my lord's many kindnesses in some small way, Asau said. I beg you to make use of me in whatever way pleases you, my lord. Antony squirmed a little at that. What kindnesses? He'd done nothing for this man. He'd overseen his enslavement, and then done nothing to help him when his lover hurt him. Esau had suffered so terribly these last few months, and Antony had let him. He didn't deserve even the slightest courtesy from Esau, let alone the reverence that shone from his submissively downturned face. "Well, look at us," he said at last, trying for cheer. "All up and around again. You've done a good job nursing us, Hanyu." "Thank you," Hanyu chirped, grinning up at him. The young man's smile transformed his face into its usual sunny lines, making Antony's shoulders sag in relief. "It's all right. I'm forgiven again. I stole all the people my sister loved most, but she still writes to me. I ruined Theo's life, but she still walks and talks with me. I enslaved Hanyu and made him cry, and we both know I'm going to punish him soon, but he still smiles at me." But then Hanyu's smile vanished. His face dimmed, not like the sun had been hidden behind a cloud, but like it had been utterly eclipsed. The young man bowed his head low. Thank you for this undeserved kindness to your undeserving, unworthy servant," he said somberly. "My lord." Antony's heart plummeted right down into his guts. What the fuck?